diversity in history and fashion.
Yes. Oh. Thank you very much, Michael. I'll just make my way over here. Thank you all so much for having me today. I'm so excited to talk about this topic. It's always so nice to be able to combine both of my majors into like one sort of situation. So my topic today is Harriet A. Brown, A Pattern for Success. I'm going to be talking about a female entrepreneur, scholar, somebody that like has a patent. Very cool, very interesting woman. She's from the 19th century, late 19th century, and very excited to speak about her with you. Okay, just going through basic housekeeping. We've got the pattern, Harriet A. Brown, the Boston Dress Cutting College, women in dressmaking and pattern drafting, and then I'll talk about my process because that blouse over there, I made it using a pattern that we have received from a very generous donation. Then I'll just talk about some major takeaways and significance of it all. Okay, the pattern. So I just wanted to start off by saying thank you, William and Sandra Hazelton. It's been such a pleasure to work with this artifact and just being able to use it to create something has been so interesting. So this is a pattern that I received to work with. It's made of a cardboard material. If you see up over here, there's little measurements and punched holes. So it can be used on a variety of different body types with a variety of different measurements. Something very interesting about it too is it accommodates for children's sizes as well as for bigger people, which they refer to as stout people. Yeah, so get into the separate pieces over here. So we've got just the general like front bodice area. Then what's really interesting about it, so I work on drafting a lot of patterns for my other major in fashion design. Something we don't really typically see anymore is having so many different one main panel for the front and then 3 for the back to accommodate for the very tiny waist that comes from corsetry, but then it flares out at the bottom over here, so that if you're wearing a hoop skirt or some padding on your hips, then you will be able to wear your blouse over top of it. Oh yeah, and another interesting thing is it came with a ruler, just a cardboard ruler. Okay, and then over here we have a measurement for the sleeve cap. This pattern, we'll get more into it later, but I had to draft my own sleeve up for it because it didn't come with a pattern for a sleeve, just the top of the sleeve. Okay, and another thing about this pattern is it was likely one of the more earlier prints of this pattern that Harriet Brown patented. Later iterations, which she details in her book, were made from pressed leather. So it would have been very interesting to be able to get my hands on that too, but it's just been so wonderful being able to work with this period. So here's the patent. In the 19th century, there was just a huge growth of different inventions, different changes, different learnings. So a lot of female inventors arose from this era, as well as male inventors. So her patent number is 392,493. And so she patented this specific kind of shirtwaist, which was basically like a type of blouse at the era that was extremely popular. So she has this specific pattern. You can see how the things that I've just showed you are in this patent, which is really neat. So going into Harriet A. Brown, who was she? Who was this inventor woman? So I feel as though she's very well epitomized in this quote from her. "I've defeated them all, for my brains have made me quite independent and without the help of any man." She seemed like a force to be reckoned with, to say the least. So she was born February 20th, 1847 in Augusta, Maine. And she starts off her book by saying, yeah, I trained for several years under tailors, then I ended up getting married that ended quickly, and she never says if it was because she was widowed or divorced, but she just quickly decides, yep, that was over. I am going to be on my own, and I'm going to build this. I'm going to invent, and I'm going to create a college for women to make their own patterns and make their own dresses, and it's a really beautiful development, I believe. So speaking on the college, it was opened October 17th in 1886, and she claims that it is the first all-women's dressmaker college in North America. I don't know if that's true because she seems she likes to exaggerate a bit, but who doesn't from time to time? So she also created the patented system of pattern cutting. The system ended up becoming the standard for the Pratt Institute, which if you're into fashion, you know that the Pratt Institute is still a very strong institute for fashion design, as well as Moody Schools in Massachusetts. So her different patterning style became a huge standard for professionals and for businesses alike. And she also boasts having participated and won awards at the Massachusetts Charitable Mechanics Association in Boston. She liked to go and enter her inventions and designs in different fairs. Speaking of inventions and designs in fairs, does anybody have any big fairs that you think of when you think the 19th century? Yes, she participated in the 1892 Chicago World's Fair, also known as the Columbia Exhibition, and they had a separate section for women inventors. And this wasn't her quote, but this was a quote of the people that had the separate women's invention section. To make no note of the inventions of women unless it is something quite distinguished and brilliant. We must not call attention to anything that would cause us to lose ground. So there was this sort of tightrope walk that the originators of this women's section of the Chicago World's Fair had, where they had to present female inventors, but they also wanted to avoid becoming stereotypical, which overlooked a lot of the more feminine home economics sort of inventions. But it also gave Harriet the opportunity to go and present her findings and her inventions to the exhibition. She ended up getting first place, which is very exciting, and she wrote about that also quite a bit in her book, which I'm happy to get to now. So she wrote this book towards the end of her career in 1902, where she just talks about, first of all, she starts talking about herself, because who wouldn't want to talk about themselves? She begins talking about how she rose into becoming such a leading person in the forefront of dressmaking and how she started her college. And then she goes more into actually how she builds the patterns and how to do the measurements and all of the stuff that I learned about in my textbooks. Looking at it, there's a lot of similarities between my flat patterning class that I'm taking right now and what she taught in her book, which I think is so amazing how ahead of her time she was in many ways. She later goes into career advice for young women that are wanting to get into the field, talking about how you have to have that tenacity and that drive to get into it, because a lot of men, they were brought up and raised in this craft, but women being in the dressmaking career, what have you, they are newer. They don't have the generational guidance that the men do. So she tells them to become artistic and to lead themselves and present themselves in the way to be taken seriously. At the end, she has a lot of sources copying and pasting different newspapers that talked about her accolades and the accolades of the dressmaking business, and also just personal letters praising her. Which, you go girl, I see you. Moving on from that, we can look at the Boston Dress Cutting College. So the main basis of her creating this college was she wanted to make a space for women to have careers. For women that didn't really have the opportunity in the past. It's very interesting to see all this develop alongside the suffragette movement and the labor movements at the time, which I'll get into later, but to see more of a development for career-driven women. So, I should have just waited until I got to this slide, but oh well. She says, commended by more than 3,000 graduates, many of whom are receiving salaries larger than the average businessman's. She wanted her girls that went to her school to have that future, and it seems a lot of them did. She also, in her book, she boasted how she offers $5 mail order courses for those that can't attend her college, which I found very interesting. It reminds me of a lot of the online courses that I'm taking for school. She also says, she was ahead of her time in many ways. She also says, it will not be an ordinary girl to whom a dressmaker can afford to pay wages during her pupillage. Her girls needed to be extraordinary. You have to work harder than the rest to get where you are. She also just wanted to show how many more institutions used her dressmaking pattern methods, her scientific method, as she said. So here's the long list that she gave us. Moving on, I was very curious as to the Dressmakers College currently. Unfortunately, it is no longer in operation. However, the place still exists, on Google. It's actually an escape room now. Moving on from there, looking at women in dressmaking and pattern drafting in general. So the women's labor movement, especially in the textile industry, was such a huge step for labor in general. So the textile industry was majority women, but these women held no standing within the unions. They had no real standing within the actual jobs themselves. Men would be given the roles as managers, and they would be given the more higher paying jobs because they could lift more. But these women were also doing extremely complicated sewing work, cutting work, dangerous jobs where you could lose a finger or your life. Unfortunately, there have been many instances in the history, and sometimes happening today overseas, in these factories that produce clothing. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory incident was a huge tragedy that changed the course for the labor movements in the United States forever. Who knows anything about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory? Yes, so to keep girls from stealing any of the precious resources of the factory, the women would be locked in the building. So fire escapes weren't really as much a thing because every day the male managers would take the key, lock the doors, nobody could get out until they were told they could. So when it's likely that a stray cigarette was thrown in one of the fabric waste piles, and the building ended up burning down with most of the girls in it. A lot of women ended up jumping out the window as an alternative to dying in the fire. So this gained a lot of publicity, and the entire city of New York was grieving these women. This also led to a lot of unionization efforts for female unions. They were around, but through this gained a lot of publicity and traction and caused these women to organize into their International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which gave these women a lot shorter work days, gave them more money, gave them more time. It gave them exits from the building, to say the least. So while I just talked about the women in labor, in the factories, there were also the tradeswomen, which were the women that were more of Brown's focus. Frances E. Willard and Mary A. Livermore made a book about 100 years of amazing women. And in this book, Harriet Brown was also mentioned. The women writing this book discussed Harriet Brown's impact, saying, by contact with working girls, she learned of the long hours, hard work and small wages, of which most of them complained. And her ardent desire was to alleviate their stress. Mrs. Brown conceived the idea of establishing a regular school of training for women who desired to make themselves self-supporting, and on the solicitation of many prominent and philanthropic women of Boston, she opened the dress cutting college. So these women, like I said earlier, were finally entering their own. They were able to have their own careers. And these women were helped under Harriet Brown. So moving on to my process, a lot lighter than the previous discussion, goodness gracious. So here's the pattern layout. I had to consult with with a lot of my professors. I emailed them, I'm like, hey, how do we piece this together? Because it just looked like a bunch of slices of cardboard to me. But luckily, I was able to work with them and figure it out. And from there, I made a muslin mock-up. For those that don't know, muslin is a cheaper material that you use as a stand-in for your final fabric. So I ended up piecing it together, sewing it up. Everything was looking good. It barely fit on the mannequin because it was so small, but we made it work. From there, my process continued. I drafted a sleeve. So like I said, the sleeve pattern wasn't provided, so I had to go on YouTube, look up videos on how to make a sleeve, and I figured it out eventually. And then I had to cut everything out. This is just a cotton calico. It's just a plain piece of cotton fabric that has print on it. And I just sewed it all together. And then I made a lining. So as you can see, you don't see any hems here. That's because I sewed two pieces. I basically made it double, then sewed it all together. Then buttonholes were my least favorite part of the process. I had to use a machine to, there's a machine setting that can just sew buttonholes, then you cut out the center part, and then you sew the buttons on with your hands. Good stuff. So this is the final blouse. I definitely did not just take a picture of it right before this. But yeah, so some things that were different from how Harriet Brown might have done it versus how I did it was, first of all, I obviously have an electric machine. I didn't have to use the trundle or crank machine that she would have had to use to sew it. So I am appreciative of that every day. My legs thank her. Anyway, and I also did machine sewed holes, buttonholes. I've hand sewed buttonholes, and it's very frustrating to say the least. So that's been a very, very good development. Another thing that was very different was how fabric printing methods changed. So around the time that Harriet Brown would have been working with this fabric, the roller method would have been developed, which is semi-similar to what we use today. We use a lot of digital printing and more industrialized. However, theirs would have been a lot smaller and a lot more of a slow process. Heaven forbid, they also would have done block printing, which is also done it's a very rudimentary method where you paint the design onto a wooden block and then press it down with a lot of weights. So major takeaways and significance of this all. First of all, this was a very cool pattern to work with. I'm nerding out of it. Also that female entrepreneurs and female inventors have been around for a long time. And they were able to create their own niches within industries that it helped other women to rise up. And there's also just the evolution and development of clothes making and patterning that we can see today. I believe that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'll answer them to the best of my abilities.
How long did it take you from your muslin pattern to finally create that?
Yeah, so I decided on when I was going to be done, and then that date approached, and I was like, oh no! So I pulled an all-nighter doing about 17 hours, So it ends up like that sometimes, but yeah, it wasn't, in comparison to my final for my draping class, that took about I'd say 36 hours. So this was a breeze compared to that. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, either one. Yeah.
I'm curious about the cardboard pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Was there an advantage to having cardboard that you could lay it down and cut around it, or was there another reason?
Yeah, a lot of it's just for transportation. Having a big heavy wooden pattern would have been difficult. It's also a lot more durable than a paper pattern or a fabric pattern, because if you mess up with your scissors, it's a lot less likely to mess up with the pattern. Yeah. Yes.
Were there directions that those were to be buttons rather than hook and eye, or was it on the pattern? Did it show buttons or did it show hook and eye? How did you determine that?
So on the pattern, it doesn't give any instructions for assembly, nor does it give instructions for if you should use buttons or hook and eye or anything of that sort. It's basically choose your own adventure. Just pick which one you think is the best. In her book, she does talk about closures for a bit, but it's more brief in comparison to the drafting stuff. Yes?
I'm curious as to whether back when this pattern was hitting the market, whether it really had dressmakers that did this for them, or whether they did the work themselves.
Yeah, so it really just depends on the amount of money you have and how nice the event is you're going to it. So a lot of families of lower class will just basically bequeath different dresses that they have to younger people, or any most women at least knew how to sew a straight line, so they could figure out how to do something a bit more boxy, a lot less fitted. So can I this around at all? So with this, oh, that's scary. So with this, it has a lot of very fine details on the paneling, having 3 different panels than the usual. If you're doing a princess scene, which is one of my favorite sorts of ways to finish a dress, you'll have just one seam here, one seam on the side, and one seam on the back. So the amount of detail in this pattern would have been for somebody with more money, because you can have 3 different seams to get the maximized fit on the dress. No, the shirt waist, my fault. Okay. Yes?
So I'm curious, when you talked about the hand-sewn buttonhole, would they have used bound buttonholes, which is constructed in fabric, or would they have done them with thread?
That one I'm actually not sure on. When I've hand-sewed a buttonhole previously, I've done just wrapping it around, but I should look more into that.
Try a bound buttonhole sometime. They look really nice. They take a little longer, but
Okay.
out of fabric.
Heck yeah. Okay, I'll look into that. Yes. Hmm? Oh goodness, I misspoke and miswrote. My apologies. Yes. Yes, again.
Why did she call it, Mrs. Brown, why did she call it a scientific method?
Yes, because of all of the mathematics involved, and also the conversation around the scientific method, the conversation around, hey, I want to be taken seriously in this industry. This is something that's well established. It's bound by science. This is how you do it. This is law. Yes.
That was kind of related to my question. So did she patent the process of patterning, or did she patent a particular pattern that she had?
Yeah, that's what I believe as well.
She created the patterns, so she
Yeah.
patented her own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
She's a bit egocentric.
A little bit, but I mean, most inventors adventures are. You have to be some sort of self-assured and crazy to be able to go in and be like, this is my patent, listen to me, even though I'm a woman.
Marie, what's your next great adventure between history and fashion?
Together, I'm not really sure. Currently, I'm working on a thesis around female hysteria for my history. Yeah, a very heavy topic to research, but I am doing a vintage-inspired dress right now for my flat patterning class, though. So, again, Victorian, but yeah. Yes?
You might be interested in the provenance of the pattern.
Okay.
It probably is from my father's great aunt. Came over from Ireland to Chicago. And she and her sister-in-law, would be my great-grandmother, worked for the Lincolns. So she was did seamstress work for Robert Charles Lincoln and his family. My great-grandmother was basically in service and did, for a brief period of time when Mary Todd Lincoln was in Chicago, stayed with her. So I don't think there's any connection between the Lincolns and the pattern, but it's one of the patterns that she used.
Okay, that's really cool.
You need to capture that provenance from Will, and that's your next step. Yes.
Sounds good. Anyone else?
Did she venture into doing any men's?
She actually started with men's. She did like a lot of tailoring for menswear before her marriage. And then after her marriage, she also briefly dabbled in it. Then she decided, I prefer to do stuff that I can actually wear. Which, that's relatable, yeah. Yes?
When you were making the shirt, whatever it's called, did you have like a specific favorite part of the process or one that was like particularly difficult?
Particularly difficult is doing the sleeves because it seems very straightforward. You just like sew it on in a certain way when it's lined. However, when you do that, you kind of get an infinite sleeve glitch where your sleeve will just connect like this when you're trying to cuff the sleeves. So that's a very unfortunate sort of thing. It just ends up being a tube that connects like that. So I had to learn basically just do it. I decided to do a top stitch sort of situation. Then I talked to my professors and they're like, girl, there's a better way to do this. And I'm like, okay, I know for next time. But yeah, one of the most satisfying parts though was how well all of the panels fit together. It was just so satisfying. I mean, she called it a scientific method. And I guess it was. It just fits together so well. Yeah, anything else?
So how did you get interested in this fashion part of it? Historical fashion.
Historical fashion. So when I was little, y'all know American Girl dolls?
Yeah.
I loved my American Girl doll that my grandma gave me, and I used to just pore over the book talking about like I had Felicity, the Revolutionary War girl, and I just loved looking at the different aspects of like Revolutionary War era fashion, and I also just love fashion on its own. I used to be a little tomboy, but then like once I hit middle school, I just was like, I'm gonna wear skirts every day. So being able to like do that step in that evolution and tie them both together has been really fun.
Thank you.
Thank